If someone had told me a year ago that a scratched car would lead me to the most meaningful part of my life, I would have laughed. He used to measure success in numbers, titles, and skyline views. She found meaning in roots, petals, and small acts of care. They came from two different worlds, one polished, the other grounded, and yet, somewhere between early morning bouquets and late-night silence, they discovered a kind of love that didn't need to be loud to be life-changing. This is not just a love story. It's a story about presence over performance, about building something real, even when the world is watching, and about how sometimes the smallest crack is where the light gets in. If you believe in quiet stories that speak loud truths, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because what you're about to hear just might stay with you long after the last word is spoken. Now let's begin. On a gentle spring morning in the heart of Seattle, where the mist lingered just a little longer over the rooftops, something as small as a scratch would quietly unravel two carefully built lives. He was Julian Mercer, a 48-year-old tech entrepreneur whose empire had grown from a single code idea scribbled on a napkin to a sprawling network of innovation labs and global partnerships. To the world, Julian was brilliance wrapped in precision, expensive suits, keynote speeches, a life lived in penthouses and boardrooms, but beneath the surface, he carried a weariness that even success couldn't disguise. She was no one famous, just a woman with soil under her nails and petals in her hair. Her name was Lila Monroe. At 36, she ran a tiny floral shop tucked between a laundromat and an old bakery. She spent her days coaxing beauty out of stems and silence, her world colored by blossoms and kindness, not by balance sheets or applause. Their lives were never meant to intersect. Until that morning, Julian had just stepped out of a boutique cafe on 4th Avenue, holding a paper cup of black coffee that steamed against the chill. He was half listening to a voice message from his legal counsel when a piercing sound split the moment, metal dragging against metal, abrupt and unforgiving. His eyes lifted, and there it was. A long, uneven scrape ran across the side of his charcoal gray Bentley. Not just a scratch, but a wound, jagged, unmistakable. Frozen a few feet away stood a woman clutching a bicycle with trembling hands. Her jacket was damp from the drizzle, her cheeks tinged with panic and wind. She looked nothing like the people Julian usually surrounded himself with. Her coat was frayed at the sleeves, her jeans bore smudges of green paint, and her boots had clearly walked more life than style. But it was her eyes that held him still. They were somewhere between hazel and gold, wide with remorse, but grounded with strength, eyes that had known challenge, eyes that didn't look away. "I didn't see your car in time," she said, her voice low but steady. "The road was wet. I lost my balance. I'm so sorry." Julian looked at her, then at the car, then back again. The man he used to be might have raised his voice, called someone, demanded a resolution, but none of that rose within him now. Instead, he said, "Are you hurt?" She blinked me. He nodded. "I think I'm fine, but your car." He glanced at the scar running across the door, then he gave a quiet, almost imperceptible shrug. "It's just a car." For a moment, neither spoke. The city moved on around them, people crossing streets, taxis honking, the light turning red, then green again. But in that tiny pause, something unspoken passed between them. "I'm Lila," she offered, her voice softening. "Julian," he replied, reaching out his hand. She shook it with hesitation, unsure of who he was, not in title but in intent. "You're not angry?" He let out the faintest smile. "Would it help if I were?" And just like that, the tension between them began to lift. Julian Mercer had spent his adult life controlling everything: outcomes, perceptions, risks. But this messy, awkward, very human moment, it felt honest and oddly rare. He glanced down at her bike, at the chipped bell shaped like a sunflower. "You live nearby?" he asked, not out of formality, but something else. She nodded. "I run a flower shop down the block, just around the corner from the used bookstore with the green awning." He looked at her again, truly looked. And for the first time in what felt like a long while, something in him stirred, something that had nothing to do with business or brilliance or being seen. A quiet beginning, born from a scratch in the rain. "I didn't turn fast enough," Lila murmured, her voice frayed at the edges. "The tires slid. I didn't see it coming until it was too late." Julian glanced again at the gash along the door of his car. The Bentley had been imported from Italy, custom detailed, with a finish so rare the wait list had stretched over a year. Normally the sight of that much damage would have tightened his jaw, pulled his temper to the surface, but not this time. Instead, something shifted. The heat of annoyance rose and then receded as though it had been replaced by a quieter question. "Are you all right?" His voice was calm, almost gentle, more surprised at itself than anything else. Lila blinked. Michi touched her chest, startled. "Yes, I think so. But your car—" He shrugged lightly and tucked his phone into the pocket of his wool coat. "Cars can be mended," he said simply. "People, not always so easily." A breath escaped her lips, part relief, part disbelief. "Lila Monroe," she said, offering her name like a cautious gift, "Julian Mercer." He extended his hand, and she shook it hesitantly. "You're not furious." Julian's lips curved slightly. Would it make the scratch disappear if I were a soft laugh escaped her? Not defensive, not anxious, just tired and strangely grateful. No, I guess it wouldn't. For a few seconds, the space between them was filled with nothing but the pulse of the city, the faint rhythm of shoes on pavement, a distant honk, the soft drizzle brushing tree leaves. Julian was used to noise. Yes, but not this kind. This was honest silence. No posturing, no expectations. It unsettled him. And yet he didn't want to leave it. "Do you live nearby?" he asked, the words meant to sound casual. They didn't. "Not far. I run a flower shop, just off Alder Lane. Down past the mural wall with the blue fox I usually ride in. It's faster than circling for parking." Julian's gaze dropped to the old bicycle beside her. The paint had worn to the metal in places, and a tiny brass bell shaped like a sunflower clung stubbornly to the handlebars. It was imperfect and utterly real. "Flowers, huh?" he said. "Not the most lucrative field, I'm guessing." She tilted her head, eyes narrowing, not defensive, but deliberate. "I didn't choose it for the money. I chose it because it gives something back. There's a kind of alchemy in turning mess into beauty. And when someone walks out holding a bouquet that reminds them of their grandmother or their first love, well, that matters to me." Julian was quiet. He hadn't expected that. In his world, words were weapons or tools used to pitch, persuade, outmaneuver, but this was something else entirely. Truth without polish, passion without agenda, and somehow it made him want to know her more. If this quiet beginning has stirred something in you, stay with us. Because sometimes a single act of kindness leads to the most unexpected chapters. Julian wasn't entirely sure why he said it. Maybe it was the way Lila stood her ground with humility. Maybe it was the way she spoke about her work, like it had soul, not strategy, but the words came before he could weigh them. "Would you let me buy you a coffee?" he asked. Lila raised an eyebrow. To make peace for the scratch. "Exactly that," he said, a half-smile forming. "A peace offering." She studied him. There was no recognition in her eyes, no awe, no calculation, only curiosity and the slightest glimmer of amusement. "All right," she said at last, "but I choose the spot." 15 minutes later they were walking down a quieter stretch of town, away from the polished storefronts and sleek facades. The city softened here, painted walls, creaky signage, laughter spilling from tiny open windows. Lila stopped outside a narrow brick building wedged between a record store and a mural of wildflowers. A small hand-painted sign above the door read, "Honeysuckle and Steam." The lettering was uneven, the edges were chipped, It was perfect. The sign above the door was chipped, the paint sun washed into a soft blur, but the charm it held was undeniable. Honeysuckle and steam had stood quietly on that block for years, its warmth spilling gently into the sidewalk without ever demanding attention. Julian Mercer had walked past it countless times before, never stopping, never noticing. But now, stepping inside with Lila beside him, the space felt like something out of another life. The scent of cinnamon clung to the air, mingling with fresh espresso wooden shelves lined the walls holding mugs that didn't match but somehow belonged together. Photographs of neighborhood gardens and laughing children framed the room with stories he didn't know, but somehow wished he did. A young barista at the counter looked up and smiled at Lila like an old friend. "The usual?" she asked. Lila nodded. "Cappuccino, light on the foam." Then turning to Julian, she raised an eyebrow. He hesitated, then said, "Just black. No sugar." They found a small table by the window, worn but lovingly polished, where sunlight dripped lazily through hand-sewn curtains. Lila wrapped both hands around her cup, letting the warmth soak into her fingers. For a moment, she just watched the street people passing, wind moving gently through leaves. Then she turned to him with quiet interest. "So, Julian, what is it that you actually do?" He smiled, unsurprised by her directness. "I lead a firm that invests in early-stage tech companies, software, artificial intelligence, a bit of sustainability work too." She tilted her head slightly, thinking, "That sounds intense." "It is," he said with a soft laugh. "Long days, tight deadlines, a lot of pressure, and more money than anyone really needs." Lila studied him openly. "You don't strike me as the type to hang out in places like this." Julian lifted his cup, eyes meeting hers. "I'm not. But maybe I should have started sooner." They talked. Not in the usual way people do to fill silence, but in the way that opens doors inside a person. Lila told him about the greenhouse her grandfather built by hand, the place where she first understood the quiet language of plants. She spoke of mornings before dawn, hands deep in soil, finding peace in petals and stems, of watching strangers cry when they received flowers meant for someone they'd loved and lost. Her words weren't rehearsed. They simply arrived, and Julian found himself doing something rare. He listened, truly listened, and then he spoke. He told her, hesitantly, how sometimes after the meetings and awards and dinners, he'd sit alone in his penthouse overlooking the city and wonder why it all felt hollow, that the last real conversation he'd had, the kind that made him feel seen, was one he couldn't even remember. Lila didn't flinch. She didn't offer advice or sympathy. She just nodded as if she understood a loneliness that had no name. At one point, she glanced at his watch, a sleek piece of European design that probably cost more than her month's rent, and said with a soft smile, "You know, for someone who lives by the clock, you seem surprisingly still today." Julian looked down at his cup, then back at her. "That's because," he said quietly, "for the first time in a long while, I don't want to be anywhere else." The moment hung between them, unspoken, tender, fragile. Lila looked away, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Careful," she said. "You're starting to sound like someone who might enjoy real life." A pause, then a glance at the time. "I should get back," she added, her tone gentle. "The afternoon customers at the shop don't wait long." Julian stood as she did. "May I walk you back?" She hesitated, not from distrust but surprise. "You don't have to, I know, but I want to." They stepped out into the changing light of late afternoon. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement damp and shining. The sun, now breaking through the clouds, turned the street into something golden and forgiving. They walked without speaking for a while, just two strangers who no longer felt quite so strange to each other. When they reached her shop, a cozy storefront lined with buckets of daisies and eucalyptus, Lila turned to him, half amused. "Well, Mr. Mercer," she said, "thank you for the coffee." Julian smiled. "Next time. Maybe I'll bring one to you." "Next time." Lila smiled, her voice half teasing. You should try something a little less boardroom, a lavender latte maybe. Julian laughed, hand brushing the side of his coat. All right, lavender it is. You have my word. She gave a small wave and slipped back into her shop, the bell above the door giving a single soft chime. Julian didn't move right away. He stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes lingering on the modest display of flowers in the window. None of them were exotic, none of them rare, and yet there was a raw honesty in their arrangement, like someone had placed them there, not to impress, but to express. He couldn't explain it, not fully, but something had shifted. It wasn't the car scratch, it wasn't the coffee, it was something else, something quieter, deeper. And for the first time in years, Julian Mercer didn't want to rush on to the next thing. He returned to his apartment that evening, the usual skyline stretching beyond his windows. But the air inside felt different, like stillness had finally been invited in. The next morning, he took his walk along a slightly different route, a subtle detour that coincidentally or not led him past Lila's flower shop. The first time he told himself it was curiosity. The second time, it was sunflowers. They might bring some life into your office, Lila had said with a smile, choosing the tallest blooms, wrapping them in craft paper, and tying them off with twine. She didn't ask questions. She didn't probe, just offered beauty and let it be. The third time, it was an excuse, a last-minute gift for a friend's engagement. But he stayed longer. Lila was working with white peonies and sprigs of eucalyptus, her hands moving with gentle precision. You just like seeing me juggle flowers, she teased. Maybe he said, watching her? Or maybe I never realized how intentional this all is. Every petal, every stem, it's not random, is it? No, she replied, eyes still focused on the bouquet. Nature doesn't improvise. It listens, it balances. You just have to pay attention. Julian did. He noticed how her fingers were quick but graceful, how her eyes lit up when a customer admired the shop window, how she greeted people by name, remembered birthdays, anniversaries, favorite colors. It wasn't just a store, it was a living place. A small pocket of joy stitched into the city's rhythm. Some afternoons they sat behind the shop on old wooden crates sipping iced tea and talking, while the breeze stirred the scent of rosemary and lavender from the herb pots nearby. Lila told him stories about her father, who had built the shop from the ground up. About summers spent barefoot in the greenhouse, about saving every tip to afford a short course in botanical design, about how a corporate internship left her empty, and how returning to flowers brought her back to herself. And Julian, he spoke less. For once he didn't feel the need to fill the space. There were no spreadsheets between them, no curated persona, no need to impress, just breath and truth. And in the quiet hum of that tiny world, Julian admitted something he hadn't said aloud to anyone, not even himself. It came softly as they unpacked boxes of tulips one late afternoon. I think he said that I've spent so many years managing deadlines and people and outcomes I forgot what it felt like to just be. And somehow being here, it reminds me, I've lived in this city for nearly 18 years, Julian said as he leaned back against the crate, watching Lila sort tulips into metal buckets. And yet I feel like I've learned more about real life in your shop these past few days than I ever have walking through my own world. Lila didn't seem surprised. Her hands kept moving, but her voice was soft and steady. That's what happens when you're always chasing the next thing, she said. You forget to actually live where you are. Her words landed with more weight than he expected. Julian watched her in silence for a long moment, then asked, Do you ever wonder if you should have aimed higher, gone after something bigger? Lila straightened slightly, but didn't pause. What I have is big, Julian. Maybe not in the way your world defines it, but it matters. People walk in here with heartbreak, with hope, with stories written on their faces, and I get to be a small part of that. Every single day. Her words lingered in him like a song you don't quite know how to stop humming. That night, Julian didn't go to the rooftop dinner he'd RSVP'd to. He went home. He took the bouquet Lila had wrapped earlier that day, delicate sunflowers and sprigs of sage, and placed it in the center of his dining table. For the first time in a long while, the space didn't feel like a showroom. It felt lived in. Over the weeks that followed, he found himself drifting back to Lila's shop more and more. Sometimes it was under the pretense of buying flowers. Other times he didn't pretend at all. He helped carry crates from delivery trucks. He wiped down shelves. He sat quietly on a stool near the counter, sipping the herbal tea. She always recommended something with chamomile and orange peel, and mostly, he just watched her. She didn't perform. She didn't try to impress. She simply existed in her world, whole, present, at ease. She moved between customers with a warmth that felt effortless and somehow sacred. She knew the names of the elderly couple who came in every Sunday. She remembered a little boy's favorite flower, red zinnias, like fire. She laughed with the lonely, comforted the grieving, and celebrated quiet joys without needing an audience. Julian noticed it all, and slowly something in him began to soften, not fade, not disappear, but change. His assistant began commenting on his lighter calendar. His driver blinked in confusion when Julian asked to be dropped off 6 blocks early just so he could walk through the neighborhood before reaching the shop. It didn't dull his ambition, but it began to redefine it. And though he didn't say it out loud, not even to himself, Julian had started to suspect something profound, that the most meaningful shift in his life wouldn't be found in a merger, a milestone, or a financial leap. It might just be found behind a flower counter where a woman created beauty not to be admired, but to be felt. The whispers began softly, as they always do. Curious smiles at business dinners, quirky remarks during board meetings, a half-teasing comment over cocktails. "So, Mercer, I hear you're trading algorithms for anemones these days." He laughed politely, brushing it off, but he could feel it. Eyes watching stories forming, and eventually they found him. One morning, he stepped into the shop with 2 coffees in hand, the usual for her. Something simple and warm. Lila greeted him with a smile, but it faltered almost instantly. She held up her phone. "Have you seen this?" On the screen was an article from a local culture site known more for its gossip than its journalism. The headline read, "From Wall Street to Wildflowers Tech Mogul, Julian Mercer and the florist from the other side of town." There was a photo clearly taken without their knowledge. Julian was laughing, holding a bouquet. Lila beside him, apron flecked with pollen, her face turned toward him with quiet ease. The tone wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It painted them as a curiosity, a contradiction, a narrative to consume. Lila's voice was quiet. "They make it sound like I'm some kind of novelty." Julian's jaw tightened, but he said nothing right away, because even in her calm, he could feel the sting beneath her words. Julian's jaw tightened as his eyes scanned the article on her phone. He hadn't known anyone was watching. Not like that. The photo was candid too. Candid. Him smiling, bouquet in hand. Lila beside him, apron smudged with pollen, head turned toward him mid-laugh, and just below that the headline, "Tech Golden Boy, trades billion-dollar deals for bouquets, a romance in bloom, or a publicity ploy." He looked up, but Lila had already folded her arms across her chest. "It's not just that they saw us," she said. "It's how they wrote it, like I'm some kind of experiment. A quirky subplot in your very curated life." "I'll call someone," Julian said quickly. "We can get it pulled. Issue a statement." Lila shook her head, firm but quiet. "That's not the point, Julian." Her voice wasn't angry. That might have been easier. It was disappointment, and somehow that stung more. "You get to manage how the world sees you," she continued. "You have people for that. Lawyers, publicists. I don't, I'm just me." For the first time since they'd met, a space opened between them, not measured in distance, but in weight. The kind of space where understanding falters and uncertainty begins to grow roots. That evening, Julian found himself at a high-rise private club, an investor's dinner he couldn't avoid. The room shimmered with crystal and curated conversations. Normally, he could slip into this world effortlessly, all polished charm and strategic presence. But tonight, everything felt louder than it was. Or maybe it was just his awareness. He heard the murmurs. His name in the pauses between champagne toasts, the not-quite laughter cloaked in curiosity. Then came the voice he had expected. Keeping a low profile. Mercer. It was Cameron Rhodes, an old university friend and current board member on one of Julian's ventures. Julian offered a tight smile. Something like that. Cameron swirled his drink lazily. I read about your floral detour. She's beautiful, no doubt, refreshing even. But you know how these things go. Worlds like yours don't usually bend. They snap. Julian's eyes met his steady. What world is that exactly? One where authenticity is a liability. Cameron shrugged, too casual. Just saying your name carries weight. These diversions, they get messy. Especially when investors start wondering if your instincts are slipping. Julian said nothing more, but the message was clear. The world he had built his name in had rules. Unwritten, but unforgiving. 2 days passed before he found the courage to return to Lila's shop. She greeted him with her usual softness, but something in her had shifted. She was kind, yes, but not open. Not the way she had been. There was a carefulness to her now, like someone who had learned to brace for something she hadn't asked for. Julian stayed until the end of the day, helping her water the last of the potted plants, not knowing how to close the distance that had begun to bloom between them. As she turned the lock on the shop door and stepped outside, the street lamp cast a pale glow over her face. I never meant for you to be dragged into this, he said quietly. Lila looked at him, her eyes carrying the fatigue of too many thoughts unspoken. But I was Julian, and I don't know what to do with that. My life was simple. Now I feel watched, judged, like I'm being turned into someone I'm not. He reached for her hand, but she gently pulled back. This isn't about you being kind. I know you are, but the world you live in, it has rules, expectations, spotlights, and I don't belong there. Not really. Julian's voice was low but steady. Then maybe those rules need to change. She met his gaze, and for a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Hope, maybe, but it didn't last. That's easy to say, she whispered. Harder to live with. And then she walked away. Not with anger, not with drama, just quiet resolve. Julian stood there long after she disappeared into the shadows in front of the shop where something tender had once begun. A place that had once felt like light, now suddenly seemed impossibly fragile. In the days that followed, the space between them didn't grow out of conflict, but from something softer, something quieter. Absence. She didn't shut him out completely, but the warmth in her voice had cooled. Their exchanges, once filled with ease and subtle laughter, were now careful. Polite. As if she were slowly closing the door she had once left open for him. The way she spoke to him now was different. Not cold, but cautious, as though she was gently folding back a part of herself she had once placed unwatched in the light. Julian noticed it in the pauses, in how her words now arrived wrapped in careful tone, as if she was guarding something once offered too freely. He texted. He called. He stopped by the shop at odd hours with no real reason. Sometimes she was busy, other times she offered him a kind smile, a few polite words, but never more than that. Each time he left, he carried the same heaviness in his chest, the ache of something quiet but unmistakable. What once flowed between them had changed. Julian had always believed that with enough effort any problem could be solved. That persistence and logic, the tools that had shaped his success, could untangle anything. But love, he was learning, didn't work like a negotiation. Love didn't yield to cleverness. It required something more raw, more vulnerable. One evening, unable to bear the stillness in his own home, Julian slipped on his coat and walked. The familiar streets greeted him in hushed tones, washed in twilight blue. A light rain had passed, leaving the sidewalks slick, glistening beneath amber street lamps. He found himself outside Lila's shop before he even realized where he was going. He stood quietly, hands in his pockets, watching his breath rise like smoke in the cold. When the door finally opened and she stepped out bundled in her old wool coat, she paused in surprise. "Julian," she said, voice gentle but tired. The kind of tiredness that doesn't come from work, but from holding too much in your heart. "I know it's late," he said softly. "But would you walk with me just for a bit?" She hesitated, then nodded. They walked side by side down the quiet street, the rhythm of their steps sinking without effort, though neither of them quite knew where they were heading. For a long time they said nothing. The silence was both comfortable and fragile. Finally, Lila spoke. "I've been thinking a lot lately," she said, "about us, about what it means to be with someone like you." Julian turned slightly toward her. "Someone like me," she nodded. "You live in a world that was never built for people like me to belong in. And I don't say that to create drama. I say it because it's true. I don't want to have to change the shape of who I am just to fit in." They stopped walking. He turned to face her. "Lila, I never asked you to change." She looked at him, not angry, but clear. "You didn't have to ask. In your world, people adapt. That's how they survive in it. I've worked hard to build a life that's mine. Quiet, grounded, honest. I don't want to lose that just because I stepped into yours." Julian's chest ached because he could feel the truth of it. The eyes that followed her when they were together, the subtle smirks, the assumptions, and how despite his silence, she had carried every bit of it on her own. "I've seen how people look at me when we're together," she continued, "like I'm just passing through. A phase, something soft and temporary. They don't see me as someone who could possibly last in your world." Julian lowered his gaze. The words weren't cruel, they were honest, and somehow that made them harder to bear. "I don't have all the answers," he said quietly. "But I know this. I haven't felt this way about anyone in a very long time. And I don't want to lose that, just because I didn't listen closely enough." Lila's eyes softened, but the hesitation in her voice remained. "This isn't just about effort, Julian. It's about whether two very different lives can truly meet without one of us disappearing in the process." Julian stepped closer. "Careful, I'm not here to change you," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not here to fix anything. I just want to learn how to stand beside you, not above, not behind, just beside." For a moment, the only sound was the distant hush of wind passing through trees. Then slowly, gently, Lila reached for his hand. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. But in the warmth of that quiet gesture, something returned, a willingness to try again. "I just want to learn how to stand beside you," Julian said, his voice steady but quiet. "That's all." Lila didn't answer right away. Instead, her gaze drifted toward the skyline where glass towers shimmered against the night like silent witnesses. The city buzzed in the distance, indifferent, yet somehow listening. When she turned back to him, her fingers tightened around his. "If we do this," she said slowly, "you have to know. I won't pretend I won't reshape myself to fit into a world I don't recognize, just to make it easier. I don't want you to." Julian replied, "I want to learn how to live more like you do, intentionally, truthfully, with heart." For the first time in days, Lila smiled. It was soft, cautious, but real. The road ahead still shimmered with uncertainty. So many questions neither of them could answer yet. But as they stood there, hand in hand, beneath the muted glow of the city, they found something stronger than fear, the courage to try. The invitation arrived unexpectedly, Weeks earlier, during a routine call with his mother, Julian had casually mentioned Lila. No fanfare, just a passing reference. He hadn't expected anything to come of it. But that Friday, a message arrived from Vivian Mercer, a woman known not for her warmth, but for her sharpness. Bring her to dinner. It wasn't a question or even a request. It was a summons. Vivian had once been a celebrated art curator before becoming a fixture in Seattle's philanthropic scene. She was elegance and edge stitched together, the kind of woman who could silence a room with a look and command loyalty with a single compliment. When Julian asked Lila to come, she hesitated. Not from fear, but from awareness. Still, she said yes. That Sunday evening, they stood at the foot of the Mercer estate, a home that felt more like a private museum. Lila wore a deep navy dress, simple and unadorned, save for a delicate gold chain at her collarbone. Her hair was loosely gathered, soft wisps escaping near her temple. She looked beautiful, not polished, not styled, but rooted. Real entirely herself. Julian squeezed her hand before ringing the bell. The door opened to reveal Vivienne, tall, poised, dressed in ivory silk. Her silver hair was swept into a perfect chignon. Her gaze flicked over Lila, quick and assessing before settling on her son. So she said with a smile that hovered between grace and challenge, "This is the florist." Lila returned the smile politely. "Yes, ma'am. It's a pleasure to meet you, I'm sure it is." Vivienne replied, stepping aside. Dinner was served in a high-ceilinged room lined with abstract paintings and carefully lit sculptures. The table was long set with antique china, crystal glasses, and silence trimmed in formality. The conversation drifted through familiar waters, art market trends, cultural grants. Lila listened more than she spoke, offering a few words when asked. She sat straight, composed, never defensive, but Julian could feel it, the weight in the air, the storm waiting behind Vivienne's watchful stillness. And then halfway through the second course it arrived. Lila Vivienne set her tone, light her fork pausing above porcelain. "I imagine life on the East Side is rather different from this." Lila looked at her calm. "It is," she said. "But different doesn't mean lesser." Julian's fork stopped midair. Vivienne's lips curved, not quite a smile, not quite a challenge. Of course, it's simply that Julian moves in particular circles, where legacy and refinement matter, where one must understand the nuances of how things appear. Lila didn't flinch. Her voice was gentle but firm. "I'm not here to appear a certain way. I'm here because I care about your son." Lila held Vivienne's gaze, steady, unflinching. "I'm not here to play a part." She said, her voice calm but unwavering. "I'm here because I care about your son." The room fell silent. Even the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to pause. Vivian Mercer set down her wine glass with a gentle click, her eyes shifting toward Julian. He looked back at her, proud but alert. He knew Lila's honesty wasn't meant to provoke, and yet he also knew how rare it was for someone to speak so plainly in his mother's world. It was the kind of truth his world had forgotten how to hold. "I love her, Mom." Julian said, his voice clear, steady. "And I don't care how it looks or what people think." Vivian studied him for a long moment, the expression on her face unreadable. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, she gave a single nod. It wasn't a blessing, but it wasn't resistance either. Later that evening, as they walked back out into the crisp night air, the city glittered below like a quiet ocean of lights. Fog crept in slowly over the harbor, softening everything it touched. Lila exhaled, her breath curling in the chill. "Well," she said, "that went better than I expected." Julian chuckled. "You were perfect." She gave a half laugh. "No, I was honest. That's just who I am." He slipped his arm around her shoulders. "It's what I love most about you." In the weeks that followed, Julian's life began to change in small but unmistakable ways. He started turning down events, dinners, black tie galas, executive mixers that once felt non-negotiable. Instead, he spent evenings helping Lila unpack deliveries, rinse out vases, or prep early morning orders. He showed up before sunrise, sleeves rolled up, apron tied awkwardly over his tailored shirts. He overwatered the orchids, he miscounted the dahlias, and he laughed at himself every time. At first, customers were surprised, some even whispered, but eventually they stopped seeing him as Julian Mercer, the tech mogul. They just saw Julian, the man who handed them flowers with soil still under his nails, and a warmth that didn't need an explanation. One afternoon, as they sat outside the shop, 2 cups of tea warming their hands, a crate of unsold marigolds at their feet, Julian turned to her. "What if?" He began, his voice tentative. "We built something together." Lila glanced at him, brow raised. "A second shop," he continued, "or a space that's both of us. Your world, mine. Something softer than strategy but smarter than spectacle. Something that just feels right." Lila tilted her head, amused. "You running a flower shop, I'd need a lot of training." He grinned. "But honestly, I'd rather learn something new beside you than keep perfecting a world I no longer feel at home in." She reached for his hand and squeezed it gently. "Let's see where this goes," she said. "As long as we stay true to who we are." The city moved around them in quiet rhythm cars, passing shoplights, flickering lives unfolding in small, ordinary ways. But Julian no longer felt like he was chasing anything. For the first time in years, he was simply here, and it was enough. The shift didn't happen overnight. It arrived slowly like sunlight through a fogged window, unannounced but certain. Julian Mercer, once the face of high-stakes tech and perfectly timed outcomes, now measured time in deliveries, soft laughter, and the way morning light fell through Lila's storefront. It was on one particularly peaceful morning. Coffee in hand, fingers still dusted with soil from replanting a stubborn fern, that the idea took root. The original shop had just reopened after a light renovation. They were sitting on the front steps, nodding to familiar faces, waving to regulars. Lila wore her usual smock streaked with pollen. Julian's shirt cuffs bore the evidence of a life far messier and far more meaningful than the one he had curated before. And somehow, in that quiet space between sips of coffee and the rustle of wind through potted lavender, the idea of building a life together no longer felt like a risk. It felt like home. It wasn't glamorous. There were no press photographers, no champagne toasts, no formal announcements. But it was real. Julian leaned back in the creaky wooden chair outside their new space, his fingers stained faintly green from replanting rosemary. A breeze swept through, rustling the leaves strung along the courtyard fence. "You know what I've realized?" he said, glancing over at Lila. She sipped her tea, amused. "You say that almost every morning." He smiled. "Maybe. But this time, it's different." She waited. "I think I spent most of my life chasing the idea of legacy titles, press deals. But when I imagined the end of that story, it never felt complete. Never felt like something I'd leave behind with pride." He paused, then looked around the planters they'd filled together, the faded chalkboard signs she hand-lettered, the smell of freshly baked bread from the cafe kitchen behind them. "This what we're building. It feels like it matters." 3 months earlier, they had opened a new space, not a replica of her flower shop, nor an echo of his corporate world, but something in between, something that was both of them. A cafe and floral gallery on the edge of Greenstone Park, filled with light, scent, and story. Lila's designs bloomed from every corner, seasonal bouquets that spoke of transitions, tenderness, celebration. Each arrangement told a quiet tale, never needing words. Julian brought in elements of wellness, locally sourced teas, community herbal workshops, digital tools to help neighbors access sustainable living more easily. They called it Woven and Wild, a name that held roots and movement, structure and soul. At first, people came out of curiosity. Social media noticed, some headlines played up his name. Ex-CEO trades spreadsheets for stems. But something shifted. Within weeks, no one came for Julian Mercer. They came because the space made them feel peaceful, inspired, grounded. Julian's old life didn't disappear. He still consulted, advised, offered strategy. But he no longer did it out of obligation or ego. He did it with intention. He no longer needed to prove himself in rooms that didn't truly see him. One afternoon, the sunlight filtered through strings of hanging ivy inside the shop. Julian stood behind the counter, piecing together a bouquet with clumsy but careful hands. Ranunculus, sage, Queen Anne's lace. Lila stood across the room, arms folded, watching him with a quiet smile. "You've come a long way," she said. He looked up. "Think I'm ready to take over?" She laughed softly. "Maybe the junior apprentice level." He grinned, holding up the slightly crooked bouquet. "Fair." She took it from him, fixing the stems with a grace that still left him in awe. "Do you ever miss the quiet?" he asked. Lila considered that for a moment. "Sometimes. But this isn't noise, it's growth. And you've given me space to grow too." That night after the last customer had left, they sat beneath strings of warm light in the courtyard. The distant sounds of the city still hummed, but here it felt far away. Lila rested her head gently on Julian's shoulder, her fingers laced with his. He glanced over, his voice low. "If someone had told me a year ago that the beginning of the most meaningful part of my life would start with a scratched car, I would have laughed." She smiled without looking up. "Sometimes it takes the smallest crack to let something real in." They stayed like that, wrapped in the kind of stillness that doesn't ask for attention, only presence. There were no cameras, no milestones, no metrics, just two people who had stopped chasing the version of life they were told to want, and instead learned how to live the one they were quietly building together. Julian Mercer once measured success by skyline views, quarterly gains, and being seen. Now he measured it by mornings with wildflowers, the soft laughter of customers who became friends, and the unwavering strength of a woman who showed him day after day that love doesn't need to be loud to be life-changing. In the end, what they built wasn't just a business, it was a life. A quiet, unhurried kind of life, rooted in presence, watered with care, and allowed to bloom not for show but for meaning. It was a home, a rhythm. A truth shared between two people who chose day after day to grow side by side. Julian Mercer began his story standing at the peak of what the world calls success. To those watching from the outside, he had everything: a tech empire, prestige, the skyline of Seattle at his feet. His life was curated to the last detail, admired, even envied. But beneath the spotlight, a quiet emptiness had followed him for years, lurking behind the applause, lingering in the silence between achievements. Because that kind of success, while dazzling, had never taught him how to feel full. Lila Monroe's life began in a very different place. She wasn't famous. She didn't chase recognition. Her world was smaller in scope, but deeper in meaning, anchored in community, in beauty, in the sacred dailiness of tending to something that grows. She lived for joy, not scale, for connection, not acclaim. And somehow, on an ordinary street corner under gray skies and beside a scratched car door, their worlds collided. What could have been a fleeting apology became a slow, brave unfolding. They faced what most would fear: differences in class, in culture, in how loudly their worlds spoke. They weathered judgment, misunderstandings, and the quiet ache of self-doubt. Julian wrestled with his legacy, how much of it had been built to be seen, not felt. Lila feared losing the life she'd crafted with such honesty, but they kept choosing each other not because it was easy, but because it was real. Not in grand, sweeping declarations, but in the simple bravery of showing up again and again with open hands and honest hearts. Together, they redefined success. It wasn't about the right circles or the perfect optics. It was about shared mornings in a shop that smelled like soil and cinnamon. It was laughter over crooked bouquets, silence over tea, tired hands, and full hearts. Julian didn't fall in love with Lila to escape his world. He fell in love with who he became in hers. And Lila didn't change to make space for him. She made room beside her for the version of him willing to stand in the light as he truly was. The deeper message in their story is this: a meaningful life isn't built on applause, it's built on peace, on intention, on the quiet courage to choose what feels true even when it doesn't look impressive, in a culture that tells us to be louder, faster, richer. What if the bravest thing we could do was simply slow down and ask ourselves, what do I actually value? What kind of life do I want to come home to? Who do I want to become when no one else is watching? Julian and Lila's story reminds us, it's never too late to choose again, to trade performance for presence, prestige for purpose, and legacy for love. Their journey isn't just about romance. It's about reimagining what a good life can look like when we stop performing and start belonging. Now we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had a moment when life invited you to choose differently? What does living authentically mean to you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your words may be the quiet light someone else needs to see. And if this story moved you even for a moment, consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us keep telling the stories that heal, uplift, and connect us. Let's keep writing the kind of stories that remind us who we really are. Until next time, thank you for listening. And remember, sometimes the quietest love is the one that changes everything.